Welcome back, everybody, to the philosophy of John Rawls. In this penultimate two lessons, we're going to examine some of the more subsidiary and smaller issues relating to Rawlsian philosophy. This video, we're going to talk about the practical application of Rawls's justice as fairness theory, and talk about the application of this to institutional justice, the concept of institutions being able to provide for the just settlement of distributive justice. And then in the final lesson, we will talk about the, as described as the internationalization of Rawlsian justice, sometimes known as global justice, and how Rawls actually conceptualizes a theory of justice on a global scale in his A Law of Peoples. But first, like I said, we're going to talk about justice of institutions in this video. So far, we have been examining the various different philosophical and theoretical positions which relate to the concepts of justice as fairness within Rawlsian philosophy, as well as the original position. Now, for those of you who do not remember from the last time, or maybe haven't covered and had an examination of the original position, remember how Rawls conceptualizes what may be described as a just society and a fair society. He argues that essentially what happens is we would be invited to partake in a thought experiment. The thought experiment essentially being the original position, whereby if we're going to explain it in a very quick and easy understanding, the original position essentially tells us that we want to try and design a society, and let's assume we're going to design a society and that every single person has an equal vote within the society. Now, in the actual conception of the original position, Rawls has it where people are actually not voting themselves, but they have individuals who delegate and vote on their behalf. But let's just talk about it as get the basic theoretical groundwork understood. So the original position is where people in society are asked, we are invited to create a society that is going to be the most just for everybody. Now, if we were to do so right now, if we were to invite everybody to a big town hall meeting and then have a discussion about what we should do about society to make it just and distributively just for everybody, there would be probably quite a lot of disagreement about who should get what. Okay, people, for example, who are quite rich, quite well off, for example, they might say, well, I want to have lower taxation. And the reason for that is obviously because they're going to be acting in their own best interests. They're going to be saying, well, I want lower taxation because I have more money and I want to be able to have as much money as I possibly can. I don't want the government taking money from me. People who are much more lower class, or who are much less well off, may say, well, I want to have a better and more fully funded welfare state. And the reason for that, of course, is because they're acting in their best position. They want to be able to be supported by the state as much as possible while they try to develop themselves as individuals, either through education or through better job prospects, etc., etc. Well, what Rawls does is he says, well, before we're going to make a decision on how to best structure a just society, I'm going to put everyone behind a veil of ignorance so that essentially you don't know about where you are in that society. You don't know anything about yourself. You know some basic preconceived understandings about yourself, but other than that, you do not know if you're going to be born rich, if you're going to be born poor, if you're going to be born black or white or male or female, anything like this. All of these things, you have no idea. Rawls argues that in this situation, in this original position, in behind the veil of ignorance, individuals will actually advocate together collectively for the most just settlement. Okay, so no longer will an individual try and argue for lower taxation for the rich because they don't know if they're going to be rich or not. So when the original position, when the veil is then lifted, the veil of ignorance is then lifted, and they find out, they will be living in a more just society because they have not essentially advocated for a principle of justice within their own best interests. That's a very basic overview of what the original position essentially advocates for. And this is the thought experiment that Rawls suggests is a good idea for trying to conceptualize the best ways in which we can order and have a just distributive system of society. All of these different things we've explored in previous lessons. Now, part 2 of a theory of justice looks more towards the practical application of some of these ideas and issues. Now, I will always say that as somebody who went and did philosophy as an undergraduate and then graduated in philosophy, who then moved into studying law, and then who has spent some time doing a PhD, where I've sort of come back and looked at some of these theoretical ideas again in terms of their application to international law specifically. I would argue that Rawls and Rawlsian theory of justice is one of the nicest pieces of philosophy you could ever read. Okay, there's some philosophers who are particularly nasty when it comes to how convoluted and complicated their writings are. We're going to discuss this later when we start looking at Immanuel Kant in this series. But Rawls really stands out, in my opinion, as one of the nicest and one of the easiest philosophers to actually read and get your head around. And so part 2 of A Theory of Justice looks more towards the practical application of some of these issues and some of these ideas. As such, we will see that Rawls provides some useful insight, essentially into the application of these principles into of society as a whole, but also when we talk about conceptualizations of justice when it comes to the application as applied to institutions. And this gives rise to the issue and the question of institutional justice. So within part 2 of A Theory of Justice, and the subsequent writings that sort of goes back and revises some of the principles of A Theory of Justice, political liberalism, what Rawls does is looks to examine a whole host of political and philosophical issues which pertain to the applications that look at justice as fairness. Arguably, the one which pertains most to the justice of institutions is that of desert, i.e. people and the conception of people getting what they deserve, the idea of people getting their just deserts in terms of the general outcome of the theory of justice, essentially. He does a very good job of framing the idea of people getting what they deserve as a morally neutral act. So this is quite interesting because given the fact that colloquially we would understand the idea of people getting what they deserve as being something of a non-morally neutral act. It is something that is a moral thing for people to do, for people to get what they deserve, whether that's a good thing or a backlash from a bad action that they have committed. So Rawls does a good job on the one hand of framing it as a morally neutral act, but on the other hand he also suggests that no one has any level of deservedness when it comes to their particular class or societal position that they are born into. So, on the one hand, it's morally neutral, but on the other hand, it is also distributive across everybody equally. No one other person is born to be more deserving of anything than anybody else, owing to their particular societal position. Whether that be someone being more deserving because they are higher class or upper class, or people being more deserving because they are lower class and deserve more in that regard. Rawls does not suggest that this is the case. He says on page 87 of A Theory of Justice, the natural distribution is either just nor unjust, neither just nor unjust, nor is it unjust that persons are born into society at some particular position. These are simply natural facts. What is just and unjust is the way that institutions deal with these facts. A very important passage, because essentially what Rawls does, and why I personally quite like Rawls quite a lot, is the idea here that we're trying to examine is essentially the fact that Rawls accepts that there are some natural facts about society that will always be the case, okay? It is naturally the case that some people are going to be born into society in a better position than others, okay? No society can have a situation where every single person is born with the exact same starting position, okay? This is where systemic injustices begin to take shape. The task for a political philosopher and the task for political philosophy is not to try and change or to condemn this natural fact. What is the job of a political philosopher and political philosophy more generally is the ways in which we talk about the application of dealing with these facts, the ways in which institutions deal with these facts, as Rawls says on page 87 of A Theory of Justice. What Rawls is doing here is shifting quote-unquote moral blame. We say here moral blame because, of course, he doesn't really load this particularly morally, but colloquially we may argue this to be moral blame, or he's shifting what is just and unjust, maybe a more accurate way of saying it, for seemingly immoral circumstances. So things like global poverty, things like wealth inequality, all of these different things, away from the people who are born into positions within that structure, onto that of the institutions which are designed to address such inequalities. So essentially what he is saying here is that it is not just or unjust that some people are born into a higher position of society, and so it is their responsibility to deal with that, or that they are immoral, or that they are unjust for being born into higher positions in society. These are simply natural facts. Where the moral blame comes from, or where we can apply standards of justice, is when we start to talk about the institutions that are designed to address such inequalities. So we recognize, so there's essentially three elements of this entire structure. You have the positions in which people are born, you have the institutions which are designed to address inequalities, and then you have the inequalities themselves. Of course, the inequalities themselves are unjust, there is an injustice that exists there, but Rawls does not ascribe a similar kind of injustice to that of the people who are born into those positions, but more to the institutions that are designed to address such inequalities. An individual who is born into a rich position within society is no more immoral for their position than somebody who's born poor. It's not their fault that they were born rich, or they were born upper class, or born wealthy. Continuing on then, let's think about the concept of social institutions and fairness and justice as fairness, something that exists within social institutions. How does this pertain to people getting their just deserts, to deservedness? Well, for Rawls, it is unreasonable to make a judgment about distributive justice on the basis of moral deservedness. This person deserves more than the other person. That doesn't seem to make sense according to Rawls. Instead, what Rawls suggests here is that the justification for deservedness ought to be made with reference to the justice of social institutions. Now, Rawls also makes the suggestion that precepts about the concept of moral deservedness, or deservedness of some kind of just settlement, will naturally presuppose justice and fairness of the basic structure of society. So in the application of these ideas, there is a presuppositional basis from which Rawls will work on and build towards to develop a more cohesive theory of justice. Now, in talking about Rawls' theory of justice, what I haven't done, really, is talk about the critiques of Rawls' theory of justice, or Rawls' philosophy more generally. The general idea behind the Great Minds in Philosophy series is to talk about the philosophers themselves and their theories, not necessarily the critiques of those theories. But this is not to suggest there isn't critiques of those theories. And Rawls is one of the very interesting philosophers who is able to, and quite nicely tries to, respond to a lot of these critiques. So when A Theory of Justice was first published, there were a number of different critiques from a number of different areas. So, for example, there was a communitarian critique, but one of the important ones was a feminist critique, talking about the concept of the family as being something that is devoid of justice as fairness, according to Rawls. And people like Okin actually responded to Rawls as a theory of justice from a feminist perspective and had a feminist critique of it, which was very, very interesting. And Rawls actually responds to a number of these when he writes Political Liberalism. So in that sense, none of these theories are without criticism at all. Okay, I think they're particularly eloquent and particularly neat, but they are not devoid of criticism. Of course, there's obviously also criticism from people like Robert Nozick, for example. But it also tells us that we can't talk about Rawls' philosophy by just reading A Theory of Justice. You have to also read Political Liberalism, which is a particularly big book, in fact. And you also have to read all of his other works as well to really get a more holistic conceptualization of what Rawls ultimately believed about a number of these things. And in the final lesson on this topic, what we will do is talk about how Rawls attempts to internationalize a theory of justice, to try and explain a theory of justice as fairness, and an original position on the basis of global justice.